Support comes from Gemma, architects, planners, and designers seeking to bring joy to their clients and communities. Details at gemastl.com.
This is St. Louis on the Air from St. Louis Public Radio. I'm Elaine Cha. It takes many minds and intentional action to make a city tick. Elected officials and community leaders are the driving force behind that. And for nearly 10 years, the city of St. Louis has counted a poet laureate among that group of people whose brains and energies keep the St. Louis city going and moving forward. If you're wondering, how does a poet laureate do that exactly? Our first guest today has some insight. Joining me in studio to share about that is the city's freshly appointed poet laureate, Pacia Elaine Anderson. Pacia, welcome back to St. Louis to St. Louis on the Air. And congratulations.
Thank you, Elaine. Glad to be here.
So in preparing for this conversation, Pacia, I realized that there are a lot of gaps in what I understand about what a poet laureate does. Last year, I spoke with Shangri-La Hu from Lake St. Louis, and she was the Midwest region's national student poet in 2023-2024. And she had talked about how some of what she was doing had to do with being a literary ambassador, engaging in activities like service projects, workshops, public readings. How much of that covers, what the responsibilities of a poet laureate are?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks for asking, Elaine. It does. Everything that you listed, it falls under that umbrella. I think the broader or easier way to think about it is you promote literacy, specifically poetry, throughout a specific area for a specific amount of time, a designated amount of time. The thing about St. Louis, last night, during my coronation ceremony, I said something like, St. Louis poets are built different because we build differently, right? And so being a poet laureate for a city like St. Louis that has such a rich history of movement and activism and organizing and being at the literal and metaphorical confluence of so many generational changes and events and seismic activities, you can't just do art for art's sake. It's more than just promoting the literacy and promoting the poetry. It is giving voice to the voiceless. It is speaking truth to power. It is holding self and others accountable so that our actions are in line with the things that we say that we are about. There's no separation between the art and the people and the forwarding of humanity and the resistance and the uprooting and the uprising, but also the building, right, and the planting of seeds. And so it's all of that. It is doing the activities. It's also bringing the challenge. It is listening, but it is also asking the questions. It is being playful, but it's also being firm. And as Lila LaFleur said last night, standing on that business.
And speaking of business, are there misconceptions that you have heard about what a poet laureate is? What qualifies a person to be that?
Yes. It's funny because when people are given honorary positions, or they are often elevated or sometimes just awarded or recognized as something, because the society tends to focus on hierarchy and competition, it's often seen as synonymous with being the quote unquote best at something. And so oftentimes people think, oh, the poet laureate means you're the best poet in the city, right? And we all know that best is subjective.
Right,
what is
right.
best to one person could be terrible to another. So that's probably the biggest misconception I've heard. It's almost like you've won the literary poetic Hunger Games and you bested everyone with your work, and now you are at the top of the thing to just be the best and exist.
Was that at all part of maybe some hesitations you had about being nominated?
Yes. Yes, because you think about those who come, well, I thought about the people who have come before me, right? And in this city, we have a wonderful foundational way of being that is you honor those whose shoulders that you have stood upon. And the shoulders that I stand upon, the previous poet laureates, they all have doctorates. You know, they all worked for decades in higher education space. They are all elders, right? So when you think about legacy, sometimes you think that honors like these have to come at the end of a long and storied and tenured life where you checked off all these things. So I did have hesitation, less about, pardon me, being good enough or being the best, and more about have I built enough legacy without really remembering that we are always building legacy as long as we are on this side of eternity and we are breathing.
Yeah.
We are still doing that. So to answer your question, I'll say a little bit more so though about less about being the best and more about have I done enough? And thankfully I have people in my life who they dream big, they expect great, and if you say this is the type of person, the type of human that I am working to be, every time there's an opportunity to transform yourself or develop or move towards that, they are going to remind you, this is what you said that you wanted to do. Now, I didn't say I wanted to be the poet laureate, right?
Right.
And so they're also really good at not taking no for an answer, which was helpful.
So were there past poet laureates for the city of St. Louis whose work you were looking at and maybe who were telling you that this is something that you should be doing?
All of them. So I want to say rest in peace and power to Dr. Michael Castro, the first poet laureate of the city of St. Louis, and rest in peace to Mama Shirley LaFleur, Shirley Bradley Price LaFleur, the second poet laureate. And you know, great love and appreciation for Jane Ellen Iber, who's the immediate past poet laureate. When I started getting calls and text messages and inquiries about, you know, can I nominate you? Are you going to nominate yourself? And I was swatting them away, like, no, what do you mean? And so I had to like really listen to people and get quiet. And then I started making phone calls. So I called Laya LaFleur, who is Shirley LaFleur's daughter. I called Jane Ellen Iber. You know, I called Adelia Parker Castro, who is Michael Castro's wife. And, you know, I asked them and I'm like, you know, I have this uncertainty or, you know, what do you think? And I was also asking for their blessing, you know, because it is more than, you know, Dr. Maya Angelou says when I go on stage, I take everybody with me. Right. So walking into this, I would be taking all of them with me, whether they are here or they have gone on to their next to their next journey. And the last thing that I would want to do is feel like because I've been around or because I know some history that I have some sort of entitlement towards it, or that makes me far more equipped to be the ambassador for the thing, because it is a lot of work. But again, we talk about carrying legacy and forwarding movement and honoring whose shoulders that we stand on. The last thing that I would ever want to do, just because I was raised a certain way, but I also understand how spirit works and moves, is be disrespectful and not go and ask that permission first, particularly if these are people who I count amongst my teachers and my mentors. And so I did have the hesitation. I did have people who were cheering for me and who were encouraging me. But when I made those calls and I got those blessings, and I won't go into specifically what was said, but I was in tears. Like, I just didn't even I hadn't accepted that these people who are giants in my mind had that level of faith in me.
Yeah.
It was very beautiful.
How much of what you've described, Pacia, actually illustrates what a poet laureate does, specifically outside the arts?
Yes. So the thing about a poet laureate, and this is true whether it is city or state, you know, regional, national, there it's the position where an artist, it's one of the only positions where an artist is elected to represent that thing or appointed to represent that thing. There's no musician laureate, right? There's no visual painting laureate. And so almost by default, you're not just a representative for literary arts, but for all of the arts. And so it includes all of that kind of legacy building and standing on the shoulders of those who came before and thinking of new ways to help people engage with the thing, particularly those who do not engage with literary arts or poetry. But it's also talking about how can the society, the culture, the arts matrix, both in the city and nationally, support all of the artists, right? And sometimes that may be because we want to bring musicians into the conversations, we collaborate through poetry with them, right? Sometimes it may not include poets at all. One of the beautiful things about the Black arts movement, and particularly the Black artist group here in St. Louis, is that it was rare, as I understand it, and from what I've been told, that you would go to a poetry reading and there weren't musicians there. There were drummers and there were flautists and all the things. Like, there wasn't a separation between the genres. And so as Poet Laureate, I feel like it is part of the responsibility to not just bring the different poetry communities together, but the arts community just itself. So I'll say that.
All right. We're going to take a quick break here, but we'll be back shortly to continue this conversation with Pacia Elaine Anderson, St. Louis's new Poet Laureate. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio. Welcome back. Let's return to our conversation with Pacia Elaine Anderson. Pacia is St. Louis's 4th Poet Laureate. She was officially sworn in on May 28th, 2025. Now, before the break, we did talk a little bit about those who came before you and your new role. You are going to be providing community input on some of the city's biggest issues. And at this point, we are in the midst of responding to a natural disaster on a scale that we have not seen in city limits for decades. And in the past, there were no poet laureates. What does it mean to be the poet laureate at this point in St. Louis's history? And is there anything that you take as an example from the poet laureates who came before you?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, it's funny, the phrase "at this point in St. Louis's history," because doesn't it always feel like we're at this point in St. Louis's history? It's just continuous the way things ebb and flow, and oftentimes it feels like they're constantly ebbing. So I don't think there's ever really been a time where we've been able to relax. We're always in this place of response. At the same time, we're in the space of being proactive and planting seeds and building. But there's always this need for response. And that's why whenever things happen, they come for the artist first. And so when I was being sworn in downtown at City Hall, I was trying to hold on to the moment. And I put this on my social media, and I kept thinking, trying to make a poem out of it, what, and just nothing would come. Everything felt forced. But I kept having this question. It's well, what would Doc do? That's what I call Dr. Castro. What would Doc do? What would Mama Shirley do? Right? And I got this whisper, this answer, and the answer was, keep doing. Right? And so I have a tendency to think a lot and try to imagine how things, and sometimes you just have to do. Sometimes the response is to just do. That is why people are in the streets. That is why not to say that people weren't being strategic, but these are rapid response hubs, because people said, I'm not going to overthink, I'm going to do, right? And so examples of that, when Dr. Castro, our first poet laureate, he was the only one who had really an uninterrupted term, a full 2 years, where he was able to do great things. So he had a series called Unity Community, which was a series of readings that brought poets from all different diverse genres of so there were spoken word artists. There were people who would be called, I guess, academic poets. There would be people whose bread and butter was the page and not the stage. It's just very beautiful, gathering and convening people. And then he also established the St. Louis Brick City Poetry Festival, which brought poets from all over the place who were already doing things, active in the streets, who were hosting events, who were curating different literary activities, together under the same roof over a week's long time. And what that did was gave us the opportunity to be together, to share a diversity of ideas, to plan, to strategize, and build something different outside of just what we were used to. And being a poet in St. Louis requires us to constantly be doing that because, like I said, while we are being proactive, while we are being strategic, we are always in response mode. And, as another point of that, Mama Shirley LaFleur, her tenure was really short. There were, after the ordinance was passed and, there were task force and there were people that when you don't share the same ideological perspectives or values or identify with certain processes, there can be conflict. And it's no secret there was conflict. St. Louis Public Radio reported on it when it was going on. And under the leadership of folks like Lewis Reed and Alderman Kennedy, we were able to come to a point of reconciliation and get the ball going. And Cheryl Walker came on as the task force person. And so Mama Shirley did have her time, although it was short. So she wasn't able to do a lot as Poet Laureate, but she had decades before that of teaching us how to use the word to activate social change, how to use the word to be disruptive, how to use the word to story keep and to channel spirit and to talk about what's going on in the times, right? And then we think about Jane Ellen Iber. I call her Janie. She's not Jane Ellen Iber, who, for decades from the very beginning was part of the Community Arts Training Institute, which at its core, shout out to Kat, all my cats.
Yep, I mean, I love it too.
All my cats is to a cross-sector training about social change, right? How do we work together in community across sectors? How do we enter community? How do we exit community? And one of the main ways that Janie did that in CAT was through poetry and through writing. And she continued, Janie's been writing a poem a day for decades. She said last night she's on 4,000 and something. And so, there's lots of examples of previous poets laureate, whether it was during their tenure or in the decades leading up to their tenure, of how we strategize, how we're proactive, how we react. But ultimately, it is to just do. Stop thinking about it so much and just go do it. Go do the thing.
So, Pacia, what do you want to do? What are your plans?
Elaine.
There's no way to escape this question.
So much, to the point where it's overwhelming. And, my vision board and my board of things, has had to get smaller and smaller and smaller. And it still needs to get smaller still. But just for purposes of time and brevity, that's one thing that I want to do. I'll work on being a little more brief. So, there are 3 buckets I think that everything can fit into. One is story keeping. So we think about that as documenting, archiving. That is artifacts and ephemera, whether that is digital, whether that is bearing witness in person, whether that is the gathering of actual physical items and housing them in a physical space. what is the story of the poets of St. Louis, the ones that are here now and the ones who are, I think about Quincy Troop in California, and I think about, Sonia Sanchez, who I think is out east. They all have ties to here, right? So what are those stories and those histories, and how are we keeping them? Second piece, I'll say, is an education piece, which is, I'll say is a skills sharing piece, skill building. So that's the education piece. We're working with young people. We're doing writers' workshops. We're developing and elevating the craft. And then the last part is what Doc Castro was all about, which is the convening, bringing all of us together, whether you publish a literary magazine, whether you host a spoken word open mic, you coach a slam team, or you have a writer's workshop in your living room and y'all meet once a year under the waning gibbous moon on the fourth Saturday of the third year, right? However you engage with the thing, us coming together out of our silos and doing it collectively.
Yeah. In our last minute, Pacia, what is the thing that you are going to do toward all of this when you leave this studio today?
The very first thing I'm going to do is hug my daughter, who I'm looking through the glass at, because so much of this has been made possible because she's taught me how to be a patient person. The second thing I'm going to do, I'm going to go talk to Mama Veronica Banks, who is my manager, and we're going to continue planning. Yeah.
Pacia Elaine Anderson is the new Poet Laureate of the city of St. Louis. Pacia, congratulations again, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
This episode was produced by Maya Norfleet.
Our audio engineer is Aaron Dorr. This podcast was mixed and edited by Aaron.
Our executive producer is Alex Hoyer.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations, and leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thank you.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.